How many of you know the Christian names of all 8 of your great-grandparents? Anyone know the name of any of their great-grandparents? One, two, about 50%. I think I might be onto somebody. I've recently begun to put together some first thoughts for a possible research project about forgetting. Adrian Forty, at Bartlett, in his fascinating collection of essays entitled The Art of Forgetting, writes, the question of how societies forget remains uninvestigated. While the topic of social memory has generated a vast literature since the late 1980s, the relationship between objects and memory continues to be uncertain, and relatively little has been written about forgetting. He wrote that in 1999, and since then, Bradford Vivian, David Gross, and Harriet Flower in the United States, and Jean-Louis Chrétien and Harold Weinrich in Europe have all written about forgetting in their respective fields. But compared to the shelves groaning under books about memory, the subject does remain relatively unexplored. Here, I propose a project that looks at the past and how memories of that past have been lost through changes in technique, evolving social mores, human movement and destruction, environmental change and simple oblivion, but whose traces physically remain and can perhaps be found if we so wish. But the event that provides the locus of the investigation is, however, an intriguing act of individual memory. I'll get rid of the hand. Around 1475, shortly after the fall of Constantinople, Henri Yvelin travelled from Cyprus to Normandy, and there acquired a fief just outside the small village of Savigny, where his distant cousins still lived, their forefathers having returned alive from the First Crusade around 1099. How did this Norman, whose ancestors had remained in the Holy Land after the Crusade, and had ended up in Cyprus, even know about his village of origin after nearly 400 years, during a period of scant lay literacy? Marc Bloch, French historian, suggests that kinship was the principal glue in medieval society. He wrote, "The best-served hero was he whose warriors were all joined to him, either by the new feudal relationship of vassalage or by the ancient tie of kinship." The blood feud, a system of summary justice consisting of reciprocal murder, remained legal in much of Europe, certainly until the end of the 13th century, being refined a little along the way in Normandy by Duke William, whose ordinance sanctioned revenge only for the murder of a father or a son. Kinfolk were very important to the vengeful. And why did Yvelin settle where he did? The fields of Normandy were then and remain exceptionally fertile, but what were the specific decisions that were made to establish the first hamlet at La Villinière and subsequent settlements at La Petite Villinière and La Grande Villinière in the adjacent valley? And so Google shot of the Grande Villinière there, and La Petite is up here, and then the first settlement is kind of over there. Here I hope to achieve a synthesis of the two disciplines in which I trained, my first degree in history and my second in landscape architecture, to investigate the archaeology, the landscape, the architecture, the agriculture, the hydrology, the technology, and the ecology of these places. Most graphic representation in the practice of landscape design is either concerned with an analysis of a present condition or a projection of a future proposal. This is a set of drawings I made for a public park in Madrid to try and explain to the client the kind of passage of the elements in the foliage and the flowers through the year. And he got it. It's a floral calendar. But the landscape architect is seldom required to illustrate the past in any depth. This I aim to attempt. Some have been here before. This is Mather and Dacuna's richly illustrated Mississippi floods, in which the great river is shown historically and geographically. And Heather mentioned James Corner on the right, some of whose drawings elegantly collage the plan view of the map with diagrams. Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus may help, notwithstanding his explanation of the theory, and this is in translation. Systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function, structuring structures. Do we have any sociologists in the room? No? Sad. Anyway, I think maybe Aristotle in the original Greek may be simpler than that. Within the theoretical framework, the study will look at the detail of the remaining patterns of landscape, which have certainly not changed significantly since the Napoleon cadastral plan of 1826. This is the hamlet, which by then was called Badfield. So here it is. This is the last year's cadastral plan. And you can see the field plan of this whole area is pretty much exactly the same. We've lost a little bit of the kind of congestion down there, but apart from that, nothing's really changed. And the evidence of the bocage vegetation itself, in particular the coppice ashnells on the left, indicate a much older field pattern. Oliver Rackham suggests that each foot in diameter of these ancient trunks represents 100 years of growth. And there are coppice stills in the hedges that are at least 8 foot, so 800 years in diameter. The minutiae of the fields as well gives clues. Some of the pastures are what's known as unimproved grassland. That is, the land has never been ploughed since the forests were cleared by Merovingian or Norse settlers. It's an extremely rare habitat. Natural England reckon there's less than 5,000 hectares in England left, which is roughly 4 times the size of Heathrow Airport. And I propose to carry out an ecological audit with quadrants studied at different times of the year to help build a picture of the age of the fields themselves. Mark Bloch again provides an intriguing insight into the landscape patterns of Normandy. Writing in Feudal Society, Volume 1, 1939, he suggests that the clearly marked contrasts between the agricultural lands of the Caux district on the one hand and those of the Caen plain on the other might well be attributed in the last analysis to difference of settlement. The irregular fields of the Caux recalling those of Norway, the elongated fields of the Bessin those of Denmark. He continues with great charm, I risk putting forward this very tentative hypothesis only through fidelity to a cherished principle of mine, never to allow the reader to forget that history has still all the incitement of an unfinished excavation. I would suggest that the benefit of Google Earth, probably more to do with relative topography, but I'll certainly try and follow up Bloch's suggestion. It's one of the great losses that he was an active resistant in France during the German occupation. He was executed at the age of 58, 10 days after the Normandy landings. One excavation I don't intend to carry out is in a small field of a cherry tree at La Grande-Villiers, known as Le Champ des Huguenots, the field of the Huguenots. One branch of Yvelin's descendants converted to Protestantism after the Reformation, and as such were denied both a place and a headstone in the graveyard of the Catholic Church in the village. They lie there still in the field in unmarked graves. And the Huguenots were in part responsible for one of the most extraordinary acts of forgetting, the Edict of Nantes, issued by Henry IV in 1598, by which he attempted to bring to an end the wars of religion by decreeing, in Article 1, firstly, let the memory of all things that have taken place on both sides remain extinguished and dormant as something that has not occurred. It will not be admitted for our state attorneys, nor any other persons, public or private, at any time or for any reason, to make mention of or initiate trial or pursuit in any court or jurisdiction whatsoever. So that's surely one of the most thorough examples of state-decreed amnesia in history. But the traces of the buried bodies may be visible under certain conditions. For sure, our ability to see the planet from the air since the beginning of the 20th century has transformed our perception of the Earth, and different rates of plant growth indicate the buried traces of previous settlements, as at nearby Saint-Sylvain on the left, where the outline of a 1st century BC farm remains clearly visible from the air. So you can see the two ponds, which are dry, and the network of dip chutes, and still the kind of traces of the original settlement 2,000 years later. Subtle differences in the landscape view on the ground reveal surprising changes too. The bocage on the dry east coast on the right of the peninsula has much less densely vegetated than in Savigny nowadays, although the medieval field pattern of small fields surrounded by high up banks is similar. The dry conditions led to less productive pasture growth, so that farmers there planted their hedge banks principally with elm, coppiced in rotation. You can't really see it, but they're much, much less tree-lined than on the west. This coppice landscape was completely wiped out by Dutch elm disease in the 1970s, and the tree cover is only now beginning to re-establish. Destructive natural forces play out along the coastline too, a generally low-lying stretch of salt marsh, dunes and estuaries, with a long, shallow intertidal zone subject to erosion and inundation twice daily, which has left no trace of the harbour at Blandeux-sur-Mer, from whence the great Norman fishing fleets of the early 16th century set sail for the cod shoals off Newfoundland. Tides that periodically flooded the Murray were kept back by tide gates from the 17th century, opened by Ronald to confound the Allied disembarkation onto Utah Beach. On the right you see a paratrooper from the 101st American Airborne Division. This may be familiar to any of you from Somerset. These tides are again threatening to flood annually, returning the north of the peninsula perhaps to the name by which it was formerly known, the Presqu'île du Cotentin. It's the almost island of the Cotentin. Since the early 1960s, tides now reveal and conceal in turn the vast Parc de Huîtres, the oyster farms, which cover hectare after hectare of sand. They stretch across the sands like modernist city plans. J.B. Jackson, in his marvellous book, The Necessity for Ruins, describes his experience in the Signal Corps of the US Army after D-Day. Armies do more than destroy, they create an order of their own. It was strange to observe how both sides superimposed a military landscape on the landscape of devastation. It was even more strange, I thought, to see how the military landscapes resembled the old pre-technological landscape, especially in the way it organized space. A great web of boundaries divided the country into innumerable sectors, and a system of different colors and different kinds of lines showed where each belonged in the hierarchy of spaces. Documentary evidence of Operation Overlord, during which Savigny was briefly on the front line, is plentiful, and some elderly witnesses to both occupation and liberation are still alive today. However, many of the departmental records of the Manche were destroyed in the Allied bombardments of Coutances and Saint-Lô. This is Saint-Lô in June 7th, 1944, and Caen. The records of the revolutionary tribunals in Coutances, for example, were pulverized and survive only in the pages of a rare 19th century history, now long out of print, but happily available as a facsimile edition from that most wonderful antiquarian resource, amazon.co.uk. The perhaps understandable paranoia of the French nuclear industry is revealed on Google Earth in the shots of the vast nuclear facility at Flamanville, capable of storing half the world's nuclear waste, decorated on the ground in bizarre pastel colours. It's like the state service manager was familiar with Giorgio Morandi. But from the air, the satellite views are pixelated beyond recognition. Although you can see the shadows of the power lines, it's incredibly high definition, the adjacent fields. And then the actual facility itself is a somewhat sinister instance of oblivion imposed by the state. Freud remarked that forgetting is often intentional and desired. Umberto Eco argued that forgetting is impossible, and Paul Ricoeur, in Memory, History, and Forgetting, explores the difference between what he terms the cortical trace and the cultural trace. He suggests that forgetting is bound up with memory, its strategies, and under certain conditions, its cultivation worthy of a genuine ars oblivionis, result in the fact that we cannot simply classify forgetting through the effacement of traces among the dysfunctions of memory alongside amnesia, nor among the distortions of memory affecting its reliability. My project will attempt to examine the physicality of the hamlets and land built and cultivated by Henri Evelyn and his descendants within the broader context of the cotton land, and to analyse the findings under the umbrella of such theorists as Bourdieu and Ricoeur, as well as the historians of the French Annales School and more contemporary writers of microhistory, and to investigate why and how so much has been